Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon.
It began softly like a whisper, arriving in a room where no one expected sound. The air itself seemed to pause, as though holding its breath, waiting for something gentle yet unexplainable to unfold. In that stillness, Morty found himself watching the world tilt ever so slightly, as if the ground beneath him carried a secret that only he could hear. It wasn't loud, it wasn't urgent. It was the quiet kind of change, the kind that seeps into your bones before you even realize it has begun. And at the heart of it, there was a child. At first, he didn't understand. He had stumbled into strange places before, followed Rick into impossible worlds where colors bent in ways they shouldn't, and voices seemed to come from the walls themselves. But this time it felt different. This time the strangeness carried warmth. There was something alive in the silence, something that made him stop fidgeting and simply listen. The child lay nestled in a cradle of light, not the harsh kind of light that buzzes and blinds, but a soft glow, like the afterglow of a fading sunset. Morty blinked, rubbed his eyes, and for once didn't speak right away. He just stood there, heart beating slow, as if afraid that any sudden word might break the spell of the moment. The child's breathing was steady, and each exhale seemed to carry a melody, the kind you can't hum because it doesn't exist in sound. It exists only in feeling. Rick muttered something behind him, dismissive, as though this discovery was no more significant than finding an old shoe. But Morty barely heard him. All the usual noise of Rick's voice, the static of inventions and complaints, seemed to fade out. What Morty felt instead was the weight of something new, a beginning. The child shifted, small hands curling slightly, and Morty felt a pang in his chest, one he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, though part of him felt nervous. It wasn't joy either, though some quiet spark stirred inside him. No, it was something softer, something older, a kind of recognition, as though this little being was not entirely new, but rather a forgotten echo returning to him. He stepped closer, his shoes scuffing against the ground in a way that sounded far too loud in the hush. He wished he could tread like clouds, light and soundless. He bent slightly, peering at the small face. The child's eyelids flickered, half opening for the briefest moment, and Morty caught sight of eyes that looked both impossibly young and strangely knowing. They did not linger long, fluttering closed again, but it was enough. A shiver ran through him, not of cold, but of recognition. That night stretched in Morty's memory, though hours may have passed like minutes. He stayed near, sitting cross-legged on the floor, unsure if he was meant to be protector, observer, or simply companion. Rick tinkered in the background, muttering about design flaws and chemical balances, but Morty couldn't bring himself to care. For once his focus was fixed not on the chaos of Rick's universe, but on the stillness of this one small life. He remembered his own childhood suddenly, in fragments like a dream he hadn't thought about in years. The way his mom's voice had sounded when she read to him, low and patient, the creak of floorboards at night when he tiptoed toward the kitchen for a sandwich, believing no one noticed. The feeling of wanting to be understood without always finding the words. That ache, that soft loneliness, lingered somewhere deep in him. And looking at the child, he realized he wasn't the only one who might have carried it. When the child shifted again, letting out a faint sigh that sounded almost like a question, Morty whispered back without thinking. The words didn't matter, half-formed sounds, gentle syllables. But he noticed something then. The child's breathing slowed, steadied, as though soothed. Morty's chest tightened in quiet awe. It felt as though something invisible had passed between them, a thread spun out of nothing but care. He didn't tell Rick about it. Some things, Morty thought, weren't meant to be spoken aloud, at least not to someone who would dismiss them with a scoff. Some things were too fragile for words. He kept the moment tucked inside, like a secret folded in paper, and slipped into his pocket. The night deepened. Stars blinked faintly through the high window, and Morty let his eyes drift upward, then back to the small form resting near him. He wondered if the stars had always looked like this, or if he was only noticing them now because of what had changed inside him. The child shifted again, a tiny movement that stirred something vast. Morty didn't know yet what role this child would play in his life, nor what he would come to mean to the child. He didn't know the paths they would walk, or the lessons tucked in the silence between their words. All he knew, in that moment, was that he wanted to stay, to watch, to listen, to learn. And somewhere inside, in a place too quiet to name, Morty felt the first thread of love weaving itself through his restless heart. Not the loud, dramatic kind that bursts like fireworks, but the steady, gentle kind, like the way waves kiss the shore again and again, never needing to be asked. Outside, the night hummed on. Inside, a boy and a child shared a silence that spoke more than words ever could. The story of what they would become had only just begun. The night after that first encounter lingered in Morty's chest like the fading warmth of a candle, soft and steady. When he woke the next morning, he couldn't quite tell if what he had seen had been a dream or something more. Yet when his eyes fell upon the cradle of light, there was no denying the truth. The child was still there, breathing quietly, a small reminder that the universe had placed something unexpected in his care. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of sleep still clinging to him, but his heart carried an unusual calm, as if it had already begun reshaping itself around this tiny presence. Rick moved about in the background, his footsteps sharp against the floor. His voice clipped with irritation as he scribbled notes and cursed under his breath. To him, the child was little more than an anomaly to be solved, a puzzle to be taken apart and understood. But to Morty, it was different. He didn't feel the need to take it apart. He didn't even feel the need to name what it was. He only felt the pull to be near it, as if proximity alone was enough to answer questions that couldn't be spoken aloud. He remembered being a child himself, sitting at the edge of rooms while adults spoke in voices that seemed louder than they needed to be. He had often felt small then, a little misplaced, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit in the picture around him. Watching the child now, he thought about how those feelings never truly left him, even as he had grown older. They lingered like shadows that stretched across years. And yet here was this small life curled in the glow of light, carrying the same quiet vulnerability he once carried. Morty found himself leaning closer, speaking softly, almost to himself. "It's okay. I'm here." He wasn't sure why he said it, or even if the child could hear him in any real way. But when the small body shifted slightly, fingers curling as if reaching for something unseen, he felt the truth of the moment. Words didn't always need to be understood to matter. The hours stretched gently. Morty stayed close, his restlessness softening into something quieter. At times he would catch his reflection in the glass, seeing himself not as the awkward boy he often felt he was, but as someone standing watch, someone steady. The thought surprised him. He had never thought of himself as steady before. And yet, beside this child, he wanted to be something safe. When Rick finally left the room, muttering about supplies he needed to fetch, the silence deepened. Morty looked again at the child, and for the first time he dared to touch the cradle of light. His hand hovered, uncertain, then lowered slowly until his fingers brushed the soft edge. It wasn't warm, not exactly, but it pulsed faintly, like the beat of a heart. The sensation traveled up his arm, leaving him breathless, as though the universe itself had acknowledged his presence. The child stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering, and Morty felt something vast and unspoken pass between them. He thought of his mom then, of the night she had stood in his doorway when he was small, just long enough to make sure he was asleep, even if he wasn't. That quiet care, unannounced but always felt, returned to him in a rush. He hadn't thought about it in years, yet it seemed to live here too, in the way he now sat watching this child breathe. Care didn't need grand gestures. He realized it lived in the small act of staying. As the day slipped into twilight, Morty hummed without realizing he was doing it. The sound was clumsy at first, low and uncertain, but the child's breathing seemed to settle into the rhythm. It wasn't a song he knew, but something that rose from inside him, shaped by memory rather than melody. A hum his younger self might have wanted to hear on nights when the world felt too large. A lullaby not written in words, but in patience. The stars began to blink through the window again, and Morty wondered if the child could feel their glow. He remembered nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining that beyond the roof, in clouds, countless lights were watching him. It had made him feel less alone, even when he didn't have the courage to tell anyone how lonely he was. Looking at the child now, Morty hoped those same lights would keep watch, weaving comfort in places he could not reach. A soft sound broke the quiet, a tiny coo, fragile but certain. Morty froze, eyes widening, then softened. The child had made a sound. Not quite a word, but more than a breath. He leaned in closer, whispering, "I hear you." It wasn't much, yet it felt like a beginning. Rick returned hours later, arms full of tools and muttering about inefficiencies. But Morty barely registered the noise. Something had already changed. In the stillness of that room, between the cradle of light and his own steady gaze, Morty had taken his first step into something he didn't yet have a name for. A role, a bond, perhaps even a quiet kind of love. And as he drifted toward sleep, sitting beside the child with the stars watching overhead, he felt the truth settle softly in his chest. Some beginnings don't arrive with a shout. Some arrive with a whisper, and stay with us forever. The night gave way to a quieter morning, and Morty woke not with the usual jolt of anxiety, but with the strange calm of someone who had been keeping watch in his dreams. He sat up slowly, blinking at the soft glow that still radiated faintly from the cradle. The child was there, still asleep, still breathing with that rhythm that seemed to guide Morty's own heartbeat. For a long moment, he just sat in silence, listening, feeling as though he had been entrusted with something far too precious for words. Rick was already busy, pacing and muttering as though the previous day had meant nothing more than an entry in his endless notebook of experiments. Morty didn't mind. If anything, Rick's distraction gave him space to continue this quiet vigil without interruption. There was a peace in it, a rhythm that Morty hadn't felt in a long time. The days with Rick were usually chaos. One invention bleeding into another, one dangerous trip tumbling into the next. But here, with the child resting gently before him, the world slowed to something human, something tender. The child stirred as morning deepened, small hands twitching in the air, as if reaching for something unseen. Morty leaned closer without even thinking, whispering the same words that had come to him the night before. "It's okay, I'm here." The words felt less like comfort and more like a promise this time. His voice wavered at first, but then steadied, as though the very act of saying it aloud gave him the strength to mean it. The child quieted again, fingers curling gently, and Morty felt that same invisible thread binding them a little tighter. The hours passed, softly. Morty began to notice small things. Tiny movements, faint expressions, the way the child's breath caught for a moment, and then settled again. He learned to listen not only to the sounds, but to the silences, the spaces between. He found himself responding to them. Even when he didn't fully understand why, he would tilt his head when the child did, or hum softly when the room grew too still, as if instinctively filling the quiet with reassurance. It felt natural in a way that surprised him, like he was remembering something he had always known. By afternoon, Rick grew impatient, muttering about the inefficiency of Morty sitting around doing nothing. But Morty didn't move. He realized that sometimes doing nothing was exactly what mattered most. Sometimes it was the staying, the waiting, the quiet presence that changed everything. Rick eventually left the room again, leaving Morty with the glow and the soft sound of the child's breathing. That was when it happened. The first sound beyond a coo, faint but distinct. A soft murmur, like a syllable half-formed, drifting into the air between them. Morty's heart skipped. He leaned forward, holding his breath, unsure if it had been real. Then the sound came again, fragile but deliberate, as though the child had found the courage to test the world with its voice. Morty's throat tightened. "I hear you," he whispered, just as he had the day before. This time his voice trembled with awe. He hadn't expected to be answered. Yet here it was, a response not in words, but in connection. The child's eyelids fluttered, opening just enough for Morty to glimpse those knowing eyes again, before they closed once more. It was fleeting, yet it burned into him like starlight, leaving a mark that would not fade. That night, as shadows stretched across the walls, Morty stayed close again. He thought about his own childhood, about nights when he had wished for someone to sit beside him, not to fix things, not to explain, but just to stay. He thought of how often he had gone unheard, how often he had been told to toughen up or move on, when all he had really needed was for someone to understand without questions. Sitting beside the child now, he realized he had the chance to give what he once longed for. The room grew cooler as the hours slipped by, and Morty pulled his jacket tighter around him. He noticed then the faint sound of breathing change again, not distressed, but restless. The child shifted as though caught in a dream, and Morty felt a sudden ache in his chest. Without thinking, he began to hum once more, the same half-formed tune that had risen from him the night before. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even steady, but the sound seemed to weave through the room like a thread of comfort. Slowly, the child's breathing steadied again, and Morty felt the relief wash over him. He leaned back, exhaling softly, and let his gaze drift upward to the stars beyond the window. They seemed closer tonight, their light more patient. He wondered if the child would grow up feeling that same comfort, knowing that someone was always out there, watching gently from afar. He hoped so. He hoped the stars themselves would carry this quiet love, long after his voice had faded. As sleep crept over him, Morty felt something shift within. The awkward boy who had always felt misplaced was still there, but now there was something else too, a growing sense of purpose, not born of grand adventures or dramatic battles, but of presence, of care, of choosing to stay when staying was all that was needed. And as the child breathed softly beside him, wrapped in that cradle of light, Morty realized that perhaps this was what it meant to truly matter, not in the noise of the world, but in the silences that only a few ever noticed. The night deepened, and the stars hummed on. Somewhere within that quiet, Morty understood the journey had begun, not with a step, but with a promise whispered in the dark. The night passed with Morty half asleep in the chair beside the glowing cradle, his head tilted against his shoulder, his breath rising and falling in time with the child's. He didn't remember when his eyes had closed, only that when they opened again, morning light was spilling into the room, soft and pale, as though the sun itself had decided to move gently so as not to wake what rested inside the glow. Morty rubbed his eyes, his body stiff, but his heart strangely calm. He turned, expecting to see the same stillness as before, but something had changed. The child was awake. Not fully, not in the way grown people are awake, but in the quiet, curious way of life just beginning to discover itself. The tiny eyes blinked slowly, pausing as though they were trying to take in the world one fragment at a time. Morty leaned forward instinctively, his breath catching, afraid that any sudden movement might break the fragile moment. The child's gaze settled on him, not long, not steady, but enough to make Morty feel as though the world had turned its full attention on him through those small eyes. They didn't speak, of course, but Morty felt as if something wordless had been exchanged, something that reached deeper than language. It left him trembling, though not with fear. He remembered what he had whispered before, the promise he had made without realizing it, and he repeated it softly now. I'm here. The child blinked again, and Morty couldn't help the quiet smile that pulled at his mouth. It was as though the universe had nodded back at him. Rick entered a little later, his voice sharp, his hands full of wires and glass containers. He barely glanced at Morty, muttering something about calibrations. But Morty hardly noticed. His focus remained fixed on the child, who now moved with tiny, unsteady gestures, fingers unfurling as if trying to touch the edges of the glow that held them. Morty watched carefully, not with the mind of a scientist, but with the heart of someone who knew how fragile beginnings could be. It was then that Morty realized something strange. When the child moved, faint ripples passed through the air, not sharp, not violent, but soft distortions, like heat waves rising off pavement. They shimmered briefly before fading, leaving the room slightly altered, though Morty couldn't say exactly how. It wasn't frightening. If anything, it felt like the room itself had sighed, adjusting around the small movements of this life. Rick grunted, scribbling notes furiously, muttering about manifestations of adaptive energy. Morty barely understood the words, but he understood the feeling. This wasn't danger, this wasn't chaos. This was the beginning of something different, something that seemed to listen, to adapt, to bend without breaking. Watching the ripples fade, Morty thought of how he himself had always bent under the weight of things, stretched thin between Rick's demands and his own heart. Maybe that was the connection. Maybe the child carried that same softness, not weakness, but the quiet strength of flexibility. The hours slipped by and Morty stayed close. He found himself responding to every ripple, every twitch with calm attention, as if his presence could guide the strangeness into gentleness. Sometimes he would hum again, the tune forming more steadily now, shaped not only by memory but by the rhythm of this new life beside him. The child seemed to respond, small shifts aligning with his voice like waves following the pull of the tide. At one point, the child made another sound, a soft broken murmur that faded into the air like a question. Morty answered without hesitation, even though his words made no real sense. I know. He kept his voice low, gentle, more tone than meaning, but he saw the way the child settled at the sound, and he felt the bond deepen again. By evening, Morty's thoughts turned inward. He remembered times when he had wished someone would answer his unspoken questions, not with explanations, but simply with presence. He remembered sitting in class, staring at the board while his mind wandered elsewhere, wishing someone would notice the way he drifted, the way he longed for understanding that never came. He realized now that the child didn't need answers either. They only needed to know they weren't alone. Rick eventually left again, grumbling about inefficiencies, and the quiet returned. Morty shifted closer to the cradle, resting his arms on his knees, his eyes growing heavy. He whispered once more, almost like a ritual now. It's okay, I'm here. He didn't know if the child understood, but he knew the words mattered to him, if not to both of them. The glow pulsed faintly, softer than before, as if acknowledging the promise. Morty leaned back, letting the sound of his own breath join the rhythm of the child's. Outside, the stars appeared once more, patient and steady, carrying their light across endless distances just to reach this small, quiet room. And as Morty drifted towards sleep again, he felt the truth settle deeper. The child's strangeness was not something to fear, nor something to dissect. It was something to learn from, something that reflected his own heart back to him. A heart that had always been softer than he knew, more resilient than he believed, and now perhaps finally beginning to understand what it meant to stay. The night closed around them gently, and Morty whispered once more, though his voice was fading into dreams, I hear you. And in the stillness, he thought he felt an answer, not in words, but in the soft ripple of air that brushed against his skin like a breath from the universe itself. Morning returned with a hush, the kind of light that drifts in slow as if reluctant to disturb what it touches. Morty opened his eyes and felt the soft rhythm of the night still lingering inside him, the echo of whispered promises and the faint ripple that had brushed against him before he drifted off. For a moment, he simply sat in the chair staring at the cradle's glow, feeling as though the world outside the room had faded to nothing. Everything important was here. The child was awake again, their tiny gaze shifting unsteadily from light to shadow, as though learning the world one flicker at a time. Morty leaned forward, his body aching from stillness, but his heart pulled gently closer. He noticed how the child's hands reached into the air, not quite grasping, not quite steady, but as if seeking connection with something unseen. Without thinking, Morty mirrored the gesture, his fingers hovering just above the glow, and though they did not touch, he felt the strange sensation of closeness. The child's movements slowed, almost matching his own, as if they recognized the rhythm between them. It struck Morty then, in the quiet, how much of his life had felt like reaching for something that never reached back. At school, at home, even on countless adventures with Rick, he had stretched toward understanding, toward acceptance, toward some sign that his feelings mattered. Most of the time, the world had been too distracted to notice. But now, in this simple exchange of small hands and mirrored movement, Morty felt a return. Something unspoken answered him, and it filled the hollow spaces inside him with warmth. Rick came and went throughout the day, his muttering a steady background hum of dismissive science. He scribbled in notebooks, tapped furiously on tools, spoke words Morty half understood about instabilities and adaptations. But Morty's attention never strayed far. The child didn't need explanations. They needed presence, and for once Morty realized so did he. As hours stretched, something new began to show. Each time the child stirred, the faint ripples in the air returned, gentle distortions that shimmered and faded. Morty began to notice a pattern. When the child shifted in uncertainty, the ripples trembled. When the child settled, soothed by his voice or his humming, the ripples smoothed like calm water. It was subtle, but Morty felt the connection. His presence seemed to guide not only the child's calm, but the very air around them. That realization filled him with awe and a quiet weight. He thought of his own softness, the way people called him nervous, clumsy, too easily swayed. For so long he had believed those traits made him weak. But here in this strange glow, his softness became strength. His patience, his willingness to stay, his empathy, these were the very things shaping the air, steadying the ripples. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't the kind of strength Rick admired, but it mattered. Later, when Rick left again, Morty found himself speaking more openly, words spilling into the stillness as if the child could catch them. He talked about small things, memories of when he was little, the sandwiches he used to sneak late at night, the way he used to lie awake wondering if anyone noticed how lonely he felt. He spoke clumsily, but the words didn't seem to matter as much as the act of sharing. The child lay quietly, eyes fluttering as though listening not to the meaning but to the intention. Morty realized then that understanding didn't always require explanation. Sometimes all that mattered was being witnessed, and for the first time in his life he felt that perhaps he was being witnessed too, not by Rick, not by the world, but by this small life that mirrored his silence with its own. As night returned, Morty felt himself sinking deeper into this bond. The stars were brighter again, their light cutting through the darkness with patient persistence. He hummed his makeshift lullaby once more, the notes weaving into the air, until the child's breathing slowed into steady rhythm. The ripples softened, fading into nothing. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a breath. "You're not alone. Not while I'm here." He didn't know why he kept repeating variations of the same promise, but each time he said it, it felt truer, as though saying it aloud anchored him as much as it anchored the child. The glow dimmed gently, as if responding in agreement, and Morty sat back with a tired smile. He thought again of his own boyhood, the ache of unspoken words, the hunger for someone to sit beside him in the dark, and in the quiet he understood something he hadn't before. Maybe the universe had given him this child not just to protect, but to remind him of the tenderness he had carried all along. The night deepened, silence folding around them like a blanket. Morty stayed awake longer than he needed to, simply watching, breathing, listening. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how long this fragile bond would last, but he knew this: he would stay as long as he could. He would answer every ripple with calm, every silence with presence, every uncertain gaze with reassurance. And as his eyes finally closed, his head tipping once more against his shoulder, Morty felt the thread between them tighten gently, not binding but connecting. The soft bond, woven in whispers and quiet promises, strong enough to last through the night. Morning arrived again, not with abruptness, but with a pale glow that seeped slowly through the cracks of the blinds. Morty stirred, his neck stiff from sleeping, half sitting, half leaning. But the first thing his eyes searched for was the cradle. The soft light still pulsed faintly from within, and the child's quiet breathing filled the room with a fragile rhythm. Morty let out a small sigh of relief, as though he had been holding his breath all night without realizing. He rubbed his eyes, but the weight of yesterday lingered on him, not as exhaustion, but as something deeper, responsibility, maybe even belonging. Rick shuffled back into the room, carrying a tray with 2 mismatched mugs of steaming liquid. He set it down on the desk without ceremony, muttering something about testing energy feedback against organic resonance. Morty only half heard the words. His focus remained on the cradle. Rick noticed. For a fleeting second, Morty caught a look in Rick's eyes. Not annoyance, not quite approval either, but something in between, almost as if Rick was calculating. Not equations this time, but Morty himself. Then it vanished behind the usual shield of impatience. "Kid's still stable," Rick said, tapping the side of the cradle. "That's good. Means my work's holding up." Morty wanted to say it wasn't just the tech keeping things steady. He wanted to point out how the child's ripple seemed to calm when he spoke, how his presence made the glow soften, but he kept quiet. Rick didn't believe in things like that, things you felt instead of measured, and yet Morty's silence didn't come from fear of being dismissed. It came from a strange protectiveness, as though what he and the child shared was too fragile to be put into Rick's words. The day passed with quiet stretches of observation. Morty barely left the room, his world condensed to the steady glow and the fragile breaths rising and falling. Each time the child stirred, the ripples returned, slight distortions in the air, like heat waves bending the world at the edges. Morty leaned closer, whispering softly, guiding his words as though he could iron out the trembling. Slowly, he began to test it. He would hum a longer note, and the ripple's edge would smooth. He would pause in silence, and the ripple would grow uneven. Again and again, the bond proved itself. The child responded not to machines, not to formulas, but to him. By evening, Morty began to sense a shift. The ripples no longer seemed entirely random. Instead, they carried faint patterns, like the beginnings of a language. He leaned in, heart racing, as though he might catch a word forming in the silence. Nothing clear yet, just the suggestion of intent, but enough to make Morty realize this connection was not one-sided. The child wasn't just reacting, they were reaching. The discovery filled him with equal parts awe and unease. What were they trying to say? Were they asking for comfort or warning him of something unseen? He didn't know, but the thought of missing it, of failing to understand, made his chest tighten. He promised himself he would listen harder, even if it meant sitting in silence for hours, straining to catch meaning where none seemed obvious. Night fell, heavier than before. The stars outside burned faintly, distant pinpricks against the wide dark. Morty stayed awake long after Rick had retreated to his workshop. The hum of tools fading down the hall. The cradle glowed softly, casting pale light across his face, and Morty found himself speaking again, his words a mix of confession and comfort. "I used to think nobody cared what I felt," he murmured. "That I could disappear and, I don't know, maybe no one would notice. But you notice, don't you?" The ripple stirred at that faint but undeniable, as if in answer. Morty's breath caught. A small smile tugged at his lips, though it was tinged with sadness. "Yeah, I think you do." A sudden sound broke the stillness, a faint low hum that didn't come from Morty or the child. The glow flickered, shifting colors for the first time. Morty froze, his pulse racing. He leaned closer. The cradle's light wasn't steady now. It wavered between soft gold and a pale, almost translucent blue. With each shift, the air rippled more strongly, pressing against him like waves lapping at his skin. Morty whispered quickly, Hey, it's okay, I'm right here." His voice cracked under the weight of urgency, but the moment he spoke, the glow steadied, returning to its gentle gold. The air calmed, the ripples smoothed. Morty sat back, his hands trembling. Whatever had just happened wasn't random. It wasn't just the child stirring. It felt like a threshold, something inside them waking, something deeper reaching outward. He realized then that their bond wasn't just about comfort anymore. It was becoming something larger, something that could shift not just air, but maybe the world around them. The thought was terrifying, but more than that, it was binding. He could not walk away. Not now. He was in this, fully, no matter what came next. Morty leaned forward again, his voice steadier now. "I don't know what you are, or what's happening to you, but I swear, I'm not gonna let you go through it alone." The glow pulsed gently, in rhythm with his words. And for the first time, Morty wondered if this promise, whispered in the dark, was not just his offering but an agreement sealed on both sides. The night stretched on, long and hushed, filled with a bond that tightened with every breath. Morty didn't notice the passing hours, only the deepening certainty that whatever the child carried, whatever ripples stirred from them, he would carry it too. When sleep finally claimed him, his head resting near the cradle, the last thing he felt was not fear or doubt, but connection, stronger than before, fragile yet unbreakable, a thread weaving him into a story that had only just begun to unfold. The morning that followed did not arrive with brightness, but with a hushed grayness that seemed to settle over everything like a soft blanket. Morty stirred slowly, his body stiff from sleeping in the awkward position beside the cradle, his cheek resting against his own folded arm. The first thing he did was glance toward the soft glow. The child was still there, breathing in that fragile, steady rhythm. Though something about the light seemed changed, slightly dimmer, slightly deeper, as though it had pulled inward during the night. Morty rubbed his eyes, but the feeling remained. Something inside the cradle had shifted, quietly but unmistakably. Rick appeared not long after, carrying another clinking tray, muttering half to himself. His eyes flicked toward the cradle, lingered for the briefest moment, then looked away, almost as if he didn't want Morty to catch whatever expression had passed through them. Morty caught it anyway. It was worry. Rick tried to cover it with the usual sharpness, saying, "Don't get attached, Morty. Things like this, things from out there, they're unstable. They burn too bright, too fast." Morty didn't respond. He sat in silence, watching the glow breathe. It wasn't about brightness or instability to him. It was about the way the child seemed to listen, the way the ripples bent toward him like the world itself recognized his voice. Rick's words couldn't shake that. Not anymore. And hours passed in a quiet stretch, each moment folding into the next. Morty remained close, sometimes whispering, sometimes just breathing alongside the cradle. He had begun to notice that even his quiet presence, no words, no sounds, was enough to calm the ripples now. The bond no longer needed to be coaxed. It existed like a current between them, flowing steady and unseen. But by late afternoon, something happened. The glow quivered, not with the flicker of distress Morty had seen before, but with a strange urgency. The air rippled outward in stronger waves, pressing against his skin, bending the edges of the room. Morty leaned closer, his breath quickening. The patterns in the ripples were clearer now, sharper. They weren't random vibrations anymore. They almost looked like shaped circles overlapping, lines weaving in and out as though the air itself were drawing. Morty whispered, "What are you trying to tell me?" His voice carried a mix of awe and fear. The ripple responded almost immediately with a sudden pulse of blue light. It washed across him like a sigh, and for a moment, Morty swore he felt something not just outside him, but inside his chest, like another heartbeat, faint but real, not his own. His eyes widened and he pressed his hand against his ribs as if to steady himself. He sat frozen, afraid to break whatever connection had just opened. The glow steadied, then pulsed again, and again Morty felt that faint echo inside him. Not painful, not frightening, but overwhelming in its intimacy. It was as though the child had reached through the barrier and touched his core, claiming space inside him. Rick's voice broke in suddenly from the doorway, sharp and practical. "Careful, Morty. Sympathetic resonance like that can leave scars. You think you're comforting it, but you might be letting it root inside you." Morty turned, his voice trembling but firm. Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's supposed to. Rick's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Not this time. He turned away, muttering something too quiet to catch, and disappeared back down the hall. The room fell silent again, except for the glow, and the quiet hum of Morty's own heartbeat doubled. He leaned forward, both hands now gripping the cradle's edge. He whispered softly, "It's okay, you're not alone in this. Whatever you're feeling, I'll feel it, with you." The glow softened, the pulsing eased, and for a long while they simply existed like that. Two beings breathing in quiet rhythm, threads of light binding them closer. Morty felt the strangeness of it, but he didn't want to let go. Not even for a second. The night fell slowly, the shadows stretching long and gentle across the floor. Morty's eyelids grew heavy, but he refused to drift too far from the cradle. Even in half-sleep, he felt the presence of that second heartbeat, faint but steady, nestled within his own. It wasn't frightening anymore. It was comforting, like a secret rhythm he had always been searching for without knowing. He dreamt, though, whether it was his dream or the child's. He couldn't be sure. He saw endless fields of soft, golden grass, rippling under a sky that seemed to breathe. He walked through them, his steps light, his body unburdened. In the distance, he saw a small figure, too small to make out clearly. But every time the wind bent the grass, he felt a tug inside his chest, urging him closer. He walked faster, reaching out, But just as he neared, the vision blurred. The light broke apart into ripples and he woke with a start. The glow was steady again, calm, but Morty's heart was racing. He wiped the sweat from his brow, whispering into the quiet, "Was that you? Did you show me that?" No answer came, at least not in words, but the faint echo inside his chest remained, a reminder that whether awake or asleep, he was no longer alone within himself. He sat back, his eyes soft but resolute. The bond was deepening, and with it came a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning. Whatever journey lay ahead, it would not be just Morty's path, nor the child's, but one they would walk together, step by quiet step, heartbeat by echoing heartbeat. And somewhere in the shadows of the house, Rick paused at his workbench, listening to the faint hum that traveled through the walls, a hum not made by machines but by something stranger, older, and far more enduring. The night stretched long, and Morty drifted only in fragments of sleep, each dream folding into the hum inside his chest, that borrowed rhythm he could no longer separate from his own. By the time dawn slipped into the room, painting faint streaks of pale light across the walls, Morty was already awake, sitting upright beside the cradle. His eyes were tired, ringed with sleeplessness, yet they carried a strange clarity. The glow of the child had steadied into something quieter, deeper, as though they had settled into the bond too, resting in the comfort of Morty's presence. Rick entered with the weight of someone who hadn't slept either, his movements sharper than usual, though his face was unreadable. He lingered by the doorway, watching Morty for a moment before breaking the silence. "You look like hell, Morty. You're not going to be useful to anyone if you burn yourself out like this." Morty didn't turn his head. His eyes stayed on the glow as he answered softly, "I can't leave them alone. Not even for a minute. It doesn't feel right." Rick grunted, the sound low, almost disapproving, though his words didn't follow the tone. "The connection's already deeper than I expected. If you keep feeding it, Morty, it'll be permanent. You understand that. Symbiosis, imprinting, call it what you want. You won't be able to cut yourself free." Morty swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't know how to explain that he wasn't afraid of permanence, that in some hidden part of him, permanence was exactly what he craved, the certainty of belonging to something greater than himself. The thought didn't scare him. It anchored him. He whispered instead, almost to himself, "Maybe that's the point." Rick didn't argue. He left without another word, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hall, and Morty was left once more with the hum of the cradle. As the day passed, Morty noticed more shifts. The glow no longer pulsed at random. It moved in rhythms, patterns that seemed to mirror his own breath and heartbeat. When Morty leaned closer, speaking softly, the child responded with a faint ripple in the air, brushing against him like an unseen hand. It wasn't only comfort anymore, it was communication. Not through words, not yet, but through presence, through rhythm, through the invisible threads binding them. Morty tested it gently. He tapped his fingers softly against the cradle 3 beats, then paused. The glow pulsed back, not perfectly, but close enough to make Morty's chest tighten with awe. Again he tried, this time humming a short tune under his breath, a lullaby he barely remembered from childhood. The air trembled, and though the notes didn't echo, the ripples shifted, weaving in and out of the melody. The child wasn't only listening, they were trying to answer. Morty smiled faintly, his eyes stinging with something unspoken. "You're learning, huh? Or maybe you're teaching me." That evening, he felt it again. The tug deep inside, the second heartbeat stirring, sinking closer with his own. It wasn't constant. It came in waves like tides brushing the edges of his being. Sometimes it filled him with warmth, other times with a quiet ache, as though the child's emotions slipped through into his own chest. He realized then that the bond was no longer just about soothing or comfort. It was sharing. What they felt, he felt. What weighed on them weighed on him, too. Morty's thoughts drifted back to the dream of the golden fields, and he wondered if it hadn't been a dream at all. Perhaps it was a glimpse into the child's memory, or maybe their longing. He shivered slightly at the thought, but didn't pull away. Instead, he whispered again, "Show me more, if you want. I'll see whatever you need me to see." That night, when he closed his eyes, the dreams returned. Not golden fields this time, but stars. Endless skies lit with quiet constellations, stretching beyond what his mind could hold. He floated there, weightless, and though no figure appeared beside him, he felt the hum inside his chest grow stronger, guiding him through the vastness like a hand holding his own. It was both overwhelming and serene, a reminder that this connection wasn't rooted to one place. It reached further, outward, into something infinite. When Morty woke, his face damp with tears he hadn't realized he shed, the cradle's glow flickered faintly, mirroring the stars he had seen. He wiped his face quickly, whispering, "I saw it. I saw where you're from, didn't I?" The ripples stirred, faint but undeniable, as if confirming what he already knew. The realization brought both wonder and fear. If the child was tied to such vastness, then their presence here was fragile, perhaps temporary. Morty's chest tightened at the thought of losing them, but he pressed his hand against the cradle, whispering with fierce gentleness, "Then I'll hold on to you for as long as I can. You're not going anywhere without me." The glow pulsed steady and warm, and for a fleeting moment Morty felt certain the bond was not only accepted but returned. In the stillness that followed, the house seemed quieter than usual. Even Rick's distant clattering in the workshop couldn't cut through the hush. Morty sat there, his hand on the cradle, the hum in his chest guiding him deeper into something he could no longer name, but trusted completely. He didn't need to understand it fully. All he needed to know was that the child was here, with him, and he with them, and that was enough. For now, for always. The night deepened, and as Morty drifted towards sleep once more, he thought not of fear, not of uncertainty, but of rhythm, light, and connection. The world outside could wait. For this moment, all that existed was the glow, the breath, and the quiet truth binding them together in ways neither time nor space could unravel. The days began to melt together, each one folding quietly into the next, like pages turning without sharp edges. Morty no longer measured time in mornings or nights, but in the rhythms of the glow, in the way the child's presence pulsed against him like an unseen tide. He ate when Rick shoved food his way, slept only in fragments, but none of it mattered. What mattered was the bond, the thread that hummed between his chest and the cradle, alive and growing stronger with every breath. Rick, though, noticed. Morty caught him watching sometimes, his sharp eyes narrowing, his face unreadable. Once late in the evening, Rick had muttered under his breath, "You're sinking too far, Morty. You're not supposed to drown in it." But Morty didn't feel like he was drowning. He felt like for the first time he was learning how to breathe. The bond deepened in ways he couldn't fully explain. Sometimes when the glow shifted, Morty would feel emotions that weren't his own. Tiny flickers of sadness, bursts of curiosity, or a warmth that filled him so fully it brought tears to his eyes. Other times he felt a restlessness, like the child reaching for something beyond the walls of the room. Morty would whisper reassurance, hum softly, and the ripples would calm, folding back into stillness. But one night, as Morty sat whispering lullabies he barely remembered, the glow trembled differently. The air thickened, as though the walls themselves were listening. The ripples stretched farther, bending not just near the cradle but into the corners of the room, brushing against the edges of space itself. Morty froze, his breath caught in his throat. He could feel it, something reaching back, not from the child, but from beyond. It was faint, like a signal carried on the wind, but it was there. A pull, a presence brushing lightly against the bond, testing it. Morty shivered, clutching the cradle's edge. His instinct was to shield, to draw the connection inward. As if by sheer will he could protect the child from being seen. He whispered, "Don't worry, I've got you. Stay with me, just with me." The glow responded instantly, pulsing faster, as though retreating from whatever had pressed against it. The bond between them tightened, anchoring itself deeper in Morty's chest. The foreign presence faded, slipping away like mist, but the awareness it left behind lingered. They were not invisible anymore. Morty didn't tell Rick at first. Part of him knew Rick probably already felt it, in the way he always seemed to sense the fabric of the universe, twitching before anyone else did. But Morty wanted to hold on to the quiet a little longer, the fragile peace of just the two of them. Still, the unease weighed on him, settling in the spaces between his breaths. The following day, Rick confirmed it without Morty asking. He appeared in the doorway, wiping oil from his hands, his voice carrying no preamble. "Signal went out last night. Not from me. Not from the house. From the kid. Low frequency. Subtle. But it's there. Somewhere out there. Something will have heard it." Morty's stomach tightened. "So, what does that mean?" Rick's eyes flicked toward the cradle, then back to Morty. "Means the quiet days are numbered. You can't keep something like this hidden forever. The universe doesn't let things stay small when they're meant to be big." Morty looked down at the glow, his hand pressing against the glass-like surface. "But they're not ready. They're just a kid." Rick shrugged, though his face carried a rare softness. "Kids don't get to decide when the world comes knocking, Morty. Neither do you." The words echoed through Morty, but he didn't let go of the cradle. Instead, he leaned closer, whispering so only the child could hear. "No matter what happens, I'm not gonna let them take you. You're not just some thing to be studied. You're mine, and I'm yours." The hum inside his chest throbbed in answer, stronger than ever, sealing the vow in silence. That night the dreams returned, but they were no longer soft fields or endless skies. Morty found himself standing in a vast dark void, stars flickering faintly around him. Ahead, he saw the same golden light as before, but now it was fractured, stretched thin as if being pulled from different directions at once. The tug inside his chest ached, sharp and insistent. He ran toward the glow, shouting. Though no sound left his mouth, every step felt heavier, the space between him and the child lengthening, until he thought he might lose sight of them completely. But then, faintly, he felt the echo inside him flare, strong, steady, pulling him forward until the distance closed, and the glow fused back together. He woke gasping, sweat slick on his skin, his hand still pressed against the cradle. The glow within was steady, calm, but Morty's heart hammered in his chest. He knew now with certainty. Others would come. They would sense what he had, maybe even more clearly. The child's bond wasn't just with him, it was with everything. And if the universe wanted it, it would not stop until it reached. Morty leaned closer, his voice shaking but full of resolve. If they come, we'll face it together. I won't let you go. The cradle pulsed softly, answering with light instead of words. But Morty understood. The bond had grown too deep to ever be undone. And even as the quiet of the night settled again, Morty knew the silence would not last forever. Somewhere out there, in the wide dark beyond the stars, something had noticed. And it was only a matter of time before it found its way to them. Morty didn't sleep much after that night. Even when exhaustion pulled at his eyelids, he fought it. Afraid that if he let go, the thread between him and the child might fray, or worse, that something else would take hold of it. He found himself sitting by the cradle longer than ever, his body stiff from hours spent in the same position, but he couldn't move. The bond demanded presence, demanded attention, as if it knew the universe was circling closer. Rick's words kept echoing. The quiet days are numbered. Morty wanted to pretend he hadn't heard them. But every time the glow pulsed a little too strong, or the room filled with that strange, charged stillness, the truth returned. They weren't alone anymore. The following evening, Morty noticed the first sign. The glow inside the cradle flickered, not weakly, not in distress, but in a rhythm, sharp and deliberate, like a heartbeat amplified into light. Morty leaned forward, whispering, Hey, what's happening? You okay? The bond inside him pulsed back, and suddenly Morty knew. It wasn't random. It was a message. Not words, not images, but intent. The child was reaching, trying to speak. He closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the cradle tighter, and let the rhythm fill him. Each flicker pressed against his chest, building until a single wordless thought rose inside him. Stay. Morty's breath caught. I'm here, he whispered, his voice trembling. I'm not going anywhere. The glow steadied, calmer now, and Morty slumped back, overwhelmed. It wasn't just a bond anymore. It was communication, faint, fractured, but real. And if he could hear them, then maybe others could too. The thought chilled him. Rick appeared not long after, carrying a device that buzzed faintly in his hand. He didn't look at Morty right away, only at the readings flashing across its surface. His jaw tightened. They've amplified it. Morty turned, panic flickering in his eyes. What do you mean they've amplified it? Rick finally looked at him, his expression a mix of frustration and something almost like pity. The kid's not just pinging now, Morty. They're broadcasting. Stronger, clearer. If I can detect it here, trust me, others out there can too. Morty shook his head, desperation rising. Then turn it off. Do something. Rick didn't answer right away. He adjusted the device, muttering under his breath before finally saying, I could dampen it, maybe mask it for a while. But Morty, this isn't a switch you can flip. This is who they are. Suppressing it might buy us time, but it won't stop what's coming. But Morty's throat tightened. He wanted to scream at Rick to demand he fix it like he fixed everything else, but deep down he knew Rick was right. The glow wasn't a mistake, it was purpose. And purposes weren't things you could cage forever. That night, the dreams returned sharper than before. Morty found himself standing at the edge of an endless plain, stars swirling above him like living eyes. In the distance, he saw the golden light, the child, but now it wasn't alone. Shadows loomed around it, tall and shifting, their outlines flickering as if they didn't belong to one shape but many. They circled, drawing closer, their movements patient, inevitable. Morty sprinted forward, his chest burning, the bond inside him pulling like a lifeline. Stay away from them, he shouted, though the words dissolved into the void. Still, the glow heard him. It pulsed brighter, clinging to him, pulling him closer. He reached the light just as the shadows closed in, and when his hands touched its warmth, a shockwave burst outward, scattering the darkness. He woke gasping, his skin damp with sweat, his heart pounding as if he'd run miles. The cradle glowed steady beside him, but Morty could still feel the echo of the shadows pressing at the edges of his mind. He knew what it meant. The presence out there wasn't just watching anymore, it was moving closer. By morning, Rick was already preparing. Strange machines hummed in the corners of the room, wires snaking across the floor. Morty watched him work, his hands clenching and unclenching, until finally he asked, "Who's coming, Rick?" "Do you know?" Rick didn't look up. Could be anyone. Could be something that wants to study it, something that wants to control it, or something that wants to end it before it grows too strong. His voice dropped lower. The universe doesn't tolerate anomalies for long, Morty. It either swallows them or destroys them. Morty's chest tightened around the bond, instinctive and fierce. He looked at the cradle, at the glow that had become part of him, and whispered under his breath, "I won't let them." That night, Morty sat closer than ever, his hand resting on the glass-like surface as if sheer touch could shield the child from what lay beyond. The hum inside his chest had grown deeper, more constant, no longer a thread but a tether binding them together. He could feel their heartbeat now, not literal, but something more profound, like the rhythm of existence itself echoing inside him. Then it happened. A soundless vibration rippled through the house, faint but undeniable, like the universe itself holding its breath. The glow flared in answer, brighter than Morty had ever seen, and for a heartbeat he swore he saw something take shape inside the light. Not just energy, not just a presence, but the outline of a small hand reaching toward him. He pressed his palm against the cradle, tears stinging his eyes. "I've got you, I promise." And somewhere far beyond, in the deep, cold stretch of stars, something stirred in response. The silence of their little world was ending. Morty barely slept after that night, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't dare. The glow had grown so intense it seemed to breathe with him, its rhythm threading into his pulse until he no longer knew where his body ended and where the child's light began. The promise he had whispered, "I've got you," still clung to his throat, heavy and unshakable. He felt like if he closed his eyes for too long, that promise might slip away, snatched by the silence waiting outside their fragile walls. We could set up more machines, their hums and flickers filling the corners of the room like nervous companions. He worked late into the night, wires dangling from his hands, eyes sharp but weary. Morty knew Rick wasn't telling him everything, and maybe that was his way of protecting him, or maybe it was Rick's way of protecting himself. Still, Morty could see it in the way Rick paused sometimes, gaze flickering to the cradle before quickly looking away. He was worried too, though he'd never admit it outright. The bond stirred inside Morty, as if sensing his unease. The glow dimmed and flared, faint pulses brushing against his chest like a soft reassurance. It felt like the child was comforting him now, as though they already knew the weight of fear and the need to soothe. Morty pressed his palm against the surface of the cradle, whispering, "Don't worry, I'll stay with you, no matter what's coming." For a time, the night seemed calm, the stillness stretching like a fragile thread, but then Morty felt it, the pressure, faint at first, then building like a storm rolling in from a horizon he couldn't see. The air seemed thicker, charged, and the machines Rick had scattered around the room began to twitch with static. A low vibration hummed beneath the floor. So subtle, Morty thought at first he imagined it, but the glow inside the cradle answered, flaring bright, and Morty's stomach dropped. Rick slammed a dial on his console, muttering curses. "They've locked onto the signal," he said, his voice tight. "We don't have much time." Morty's heart leapt into his throat. "What do you mean locked on? Who's they?" Rick didn't meet his eyes, only kept working. The blue light from the screens casting deep shadows on his face. Doesn't matter who. Could be collectors. Could be exterminators. Could be something worse. Point is, they're here now. Morty staggered back, his mind spinning. He turned to the cradle, to the light pulsing like a heartbeat that wasn't his but felt inseparable. He felt the wordless thought rise in him again, clearer this time. Stay. It wasn't just a plea. It was an anchor, a command, wrapped in trust. The house shook faintly like a whisper against the foundation. Morty gasped, looking around. "Rick, it's starting." Rick growled, flipping switches faster. "I can mask him for maybe a few more minutes, maybe less. Morty, listen to me. If they get through, you run. Don't argue. Don't think, just run." But Morty shook his head violently, tears burning behind his eyes. "No, I'm not leaving them. I told them I'd stay." His voice cracked on the word, but he didn't care. He clung to the cradle, his forehead resting against the glass. The bond inside him pulsed strong, echoing his defiance, and for the first time, Morty felt not just reassurance, but resolve flowing back from the child. They weren't afraid. They were ready. Another tremor rippled through the air, stronger this time, and Morty felt something vast brush against his awareness, a presence cold and immense, like a shadow sliding across the edge of the stars. His breath stilled. It wasn't imagination. They weren't dreams. Something was here. The glow inside the cradle surged suddenly, so bright Morty had to squint. He stumbled back, but the tether between them pulled him close again, almost painfully. The child was reaching, stretching beyond the cradle, their presence pressing into Morty's chest, into his very breath. He gasped, overwhelmed, as images flickered behind his eyes. Not memories, not quite visions, but fragments. An endless sky fractured by storms. A hand reaching upward, a lullaby without words, just hums and echoes of comfort. He understood then. They weren't just calling him. They were showing him who they were. Morty choked on a sob, his knees giving way as he leaned against the cradle, trembling under the force of the bond. "I see you," he whispered hoarsely. "I see you, and I'm not letting go." The glow calmed slightly, settling into a steadier rhythm, but outside the tremors deepened. The lights flickered, Rick's machines whined with static, and the air felt thin, stretched, like the house itself was being peeled open from the seams. Rick finally stopped his frantic movements and looked up, his face grim. "Morty, it's too late. They're breaching." Morty's blood ran cold, but even as fear clawed at him, he tightened his grip on the cradle. He wasn't running. Not now, not ever. The bond inside him flared like fire, fierce and unyielding, and in that moment, Morty knew the quiet days were gone, and the first step into something vast, terrifying, and extraordinary had begun. The walls shuddered again, not with sound but with silence so deep it felt like gravity itself had shifted. Morty's breath caught, his eyes locking on the cradle as the glow swelled, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw the outline of the child once more, clearer than before. A silhouette, fragile yet radiant, their presence expanding outward, ready to face whatever had come. And just as the air split with that impossible stillness, Morty whispered, with every shred of devotion in him, "I'm here. We're together. Always." The universe answered. The silence that followed Rick's warning was not like any silence Morty had ever known. It wasn't stillness. Not emptiness. It was heavy, as if something vast and watching pressed against the walls of their little world. The house itself seemed to shiver under it, beams creaking faintly, air trembling with the faintest vibration that wasn't sound but presence. Morty's chest tightened, not only with fear but with the bond pulsing hot and urgent inside him, the glow in the cradle swelling like a heart on the verge of breaking open. He didn't move away. If anything, he leaned closer, pressing his forehead once more against the glass, letting the hum inside his body and the radiance inside the cradle merge into one rhythm. "I'm with you," he whispered, voice shaking but certain. "No matter what comes, I'm not letting go." The glow pulsed in response, steady and strong, and for a fleeting moment Morty swore he felt fingers, small, tender, not yet fully formed, press against his own through the barrier. His breath hitched. They weren't just presence anymore. They were becoming. Rick muttered from behind, his hands darting across consoles, screens flickering with unreadable symbols. "Morty, you don't understand. Once they breach, there's no undoing it. We can't hide anymore." Morty turned, tears trembling in his eyes, but his voice firm. "Then we don't hide. We face it. Together." Rick stopped for just a second, his gaze flicking between Morty and the cradle. For once, there was no sarcasm, no bite in his voice. Only a raw edge of resignation. "You really don't get it, do you, kid? Together or not, the universe doesn't play fair. It doesn't care about promises." Morty clenched his fists, the bond thrumming like fire in his veins. "Maybe it doesn't, but I do, and that's enough." Before Rick could answer, the air split. Not with light, not with sound, something stranger. A seam opened in the fabric of the room itself, a shimmer like cracked glass spreading across the far wall. Morty froze. His breath stuck in his throat, shapes moved within the fracture, tall and shifting, their edges blurred as though reality could not decide what form they should take. The bond inside Morty flared fiercely, pulling him closer to the cradle, until his entire body pressed against it. The glow expanded, casting the room in warm gold, pushing back against the chill emanating from the fracture. Morty felt the child's intent, clear and sharp now, pressing into him. "Do not fear. Stand." He stood, shaking, barely breathing, but he stood. The fracture widened, and from it stepped figures. If they could be called that, their bodies flickered between shapes. Shadows one moment, faceless light the next. They radiated not warmth but hunger, an emptiness that sought to swallow. Morty's knees trembled, but the bond surged, steadying him, filling the hollow spaces inside him with something unshakable. One of the figures spoke, though it wasn't speech, just a vibration inside his skull, cold and echoing. "The anomaly does not belong here. Surrender it." Morty's chest tightened. His lips moved before his mind could catch up. "No, they're not an anomaly. They're They're my family. The glow inside the cradle brightened at his words, as if affirming the claim, wrapping him in its radiance. The figures shifted uneasily, their shapes quivering against the gold light. Rick, standing tense behind his machines, muttered, "Morty, what are you doing?" But Morty didn't answer. He couldn't. The tether inside him demanded his whole being, pulling him into a stillness that felt older than fear. The child's light poured into him, flowing through every corner of his chest until he glowed faintly himself, golden veins beneath fragile skin. The figures pressed closer. "You do not understand what you hold. It will outgrow you. It will consume you." Morty's voice trembled, but the words rose with quiet conviction. "Maybe, but until then, I'll give it everything I've got." And then it happened. The bond, straining for nights, snapped open, not broken, but unleashed. Morty gasped as a surge of energy flooded the room, not violent but vast. The glow poured outward, filling every corner, spilling beyond walls and into the fracture itself. The figures staggered, their forms trembling, their hunger met not with fear but with a warmth they couldn't swallow. Morty's eyes burned with tears, but he kept his hand pressed to the cradle, whispering again and again, "You're not alone, you're not alone." The child responded with a pulse so strong it rattled the air, a silent cry of belonging that reverberated outward like a bell across the void. For a moment the fracture quivered, the figures recoiling, their shapes fraying under the golden radiance. Rick shielded his eyes, his voice rough with awe. He didn't want to admit, "Morty, they're pushing them back." And indeed, the impossible was unfolding. The light from the child wasn't force, wasn't destruction. It was presence, a truth so pure the shadows couldn't bear to touch it. The fracture shuddered, narrowing as the figures dissolved into their own instability, fading back into the void that had birthed them. When at last the shimmer collapsed and the room stilled, Morty collapsed to his knees, his hands still clinging desperately to the cradle, his chest heaved, his body trembling, but the bond remained strong, steady, and whole. The glow dimmed to a soft hum, as though the child too was exhausted but content. Rick exhaled a shaky breath, running a hand down his face. "You have no idea what you've just set in motion." Morty looked up at him, sweat glistening, his eyes red but unwavering. "I don't care. As long as they're safe." Rick stared at him for a long time, something unreadable flickering across his face. At last he muttered, almost too quietly, "Safe isn't what the universe gives, but maybe it's what you make." Morty lowered his head again, pressing his hand to the cradle. The glow responded with one last gentle pulse, like a lullaby inside his bones. He closed his eyes, whispering, "Rest now. I'll watch over you." And for the first time since the silence had broken, Morty allowed his own body to lean into the quiet, his eyelids heavy, his heart wrapped in the warmth of a bond that had withstood the dark. The night did not feel safe, but it felt whole. The house held its breath after the breach closed, as if the walls themselves weren't sure whether they'd survived or were only pretending to. Morty stayed kneeling by the cradle, his hand pressed to its warm surface, the hum inside him steady but faint now, as though both he and the child had given everything they had to withstand the storm. His body shook with exhaustion, but he refused to move. He didn't trust silence anymore. Silence had teeth. Rick's machines sputtered into stillness one by one, their lights fading as though they too had been drained by what had passed. Rick himself slumped into a chair, his shoulders heavy, eyes shadowed. He didn't speak at first. He just watched Morty, the faint glow of the cradle reflecting in his tired gaze. When his voice finally came, it was quieter than Morty expected. "You do realize it's not over, right?" Morty swallowed, his throat raw, but he didn't look away from the cradle. "I know." Rick sighed, running a hand down his face. "Most people after staring down something like that would want to run. You don't." Morty shook his head, his hair sticking damp to his forehead. "I can't. Not from them. Not ever." The bond stirred inside him, fragile but clear, like the soft murmur of a dream. Morty felt it more than heard it. Gratitude, warmth, the faintest impression of trust too deep for words. His eyes burned, tears threatening again. He whispered, "They need me, and maybe I need them too." Rick's gaze lingered on him, unreadable. For once he didn't argue. He only muttered, "You sound like a parent." Morty almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat, replaced by something heavier, quieter. Maybe that was what he was now. Not by choice, not by blood, but by bond. A connection that asked nothing except that he stay, and he had chosen to answer. The night stretched on, and for the first time in what felt like forever, no fractures split the air, no shadows pressed in. Morty allowed himself to lean against the cradle, his eyes fluttering half shut, his breath sinking with the glow's gentle rhythm. His exhaustion wrapped around him, but beneath it lay something else, a seed of understanding. What had happened tonight wasn't just defense. It wasn't luck. The child's light hadn't simply pushed the shadows back. It had called something deeper from Morty himself. The tether between them had grown, stretched until he'd felt not just their need but their being. And in answering it, he had changed. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones, as though a part of their glow now lived inside him. When dawn finally crept across the horizon, its pale light filtering weakly through the blinds, Morty was still awake. His body ached, but his mind felt sharpened in a strange, quiet way. He looked at the cradle, the glow dimmed to a soft, steady pulse, and whispered, "You're safe, for now. That's enough." Rick stirred behind him, groaning as he rose from the chair. "Don't fool yourself into thinking it's done. Word's out now. There'll be others, hungrier, stronger, smarter. What you fought off tonight was just a taste." Morty turned slowly, his voice calm despite the weight of Rick's warning. "Then we'll fight again. And again, as long as it takes." Rick studied him for a long moment, as if seeing someone new in the boy who had once followed him blindly. He gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Didn't think you had this in you, Morty." Morty's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't feel stronger. He didn't feel brave. He just felt bound by something he couldn't let go of, even if he tried. The day passed in weary stillness. Morty tended to the cradle, speaking softly even when the glow didn't answer, telling stories of nothing in particular, just to fill the air with something gentle. Rick worked in silence, building or dismantling things. Morty didn't understand, but Morty noticed how often his grandfather's eyes drifted back to the cradle. For all his words, Rick was watching too. As the sun set again, Morty felt the bond stir with more clarity. This time it wasn't fear or urgency, it was memory. Fleeting impressions brushed his mind, not his own, stars seen from above, a song hummed without words, the faint warmth of hands that might once have held the child before him. Morty closed his eyes, letting the images wash over him, a lullaby from a place he couldn't name. When he opened them again, he felt heavier, but also more certain. The child wasn't just his to protect. It carried something older, something vast. And yet, somehow, in their quiet glow, they were as fragile as he was. That fragility bound them closer than anything else could. Rick's voice broke the silence, gruff but not unkind. "Morty, you can't save the whole damn universe. You can barely save yourself most days." Morty didn't argue. He simply looked at the cradle, then back at Rick, his voice steady. "Maybe I can't save everything, but I can save them, and that's enough." Rick's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He turned away before Morty could see it fully, muttering something about needing more coffee. Night deepened, stars scattered outside the window. Morty lay close to the cradle, the bond quiet now, restful. He thought of the shadows, of the fracture, of how small and breakable everything felt in the face of the infinite. Yet here, in this small room, in this moment, there was a kind of peace, not safety, not certainty, but peace. Morty closed his eyes, his hand still resting on the warm surface, and whispered one last time, "Sleep well. I'll keep watch." The glow pulsed gently like a sigh. And with that, the night carried them both into a silence that, for once, held no threat, only rest. The night's fragile peace lingered longer than Morty expected, as though the house itself had decided to give them a reprieve. Morning light bled gently across the walls, pale and soft. But Morty felt its weight differently this time. Each passing hour no longer felt like a countdown to chaos. It was more like a borrowed gift, a small stretch of quiet carved out between storms. He sat by the cradle, eyes heavy but steady, the bond humming faintly in his chest like a thread tying him to something greater than himself. Rick moved around the room, restless as always, tinkering with scattered tools. His muttering was less sharp, though, as if even he was caught in the strange stillness. From time to time, his gaze flicked to Morty, then to the cradle, but he never said much. Morty knew better than to expect comfort from him, but in the silence, Rick's presence was oddly grounding. For all his cynicism, he hadn't walked away. Hours turned to dusk, and the second night came. The stars beyond the window glittered cold and distant, reminding Morty of the vastness pressing in on them, but the glow in the cradle softened that vastness, turning it into something bearable. The bond pulsed stronger this time, drawing Morty inward. He closed his eyes and let himself sink into it deeper than before. This time what came wasn't just faint impressions. It was clearer, like shards of memory brushing against his own. He saw landscapes alien and beautiful, skies split with colors no human tongue could name, and a warmth that belonged to something both powerful and tender. He heard laughter, faint, fleeting, echoing like the memory of a family long lost. It wasn't his, but the ache it left in his chest was very real. Morty opened his eyes slowly, his breath trembling. He whispered, "You're showing me who you are." His voice cracked, but he didn't look away from the glow. "Or who you were." The bond quivered gently in reply. Not words. Not even intent, exactly. Just closeness. Morty realized then that what connected them wasn't about understanding in the way Rick might analyze. It was about trust. The child trusted him enough to let him glimpse their heart, and in return, Morty offered the only thing he could, his promise to stay. But promises had weight, and in the corner of his mind, Morty felt the shadow of what Rick had said. It wasn't over. Others would come. Each quiet night like this was one less they could count on. Later, Rick finally broke the long silence. His voice was rough, but unusually low. "Morty, you've got to start thinking about the cost." Morty turned, frowning faintly. "What do you mean?" Rick's eyes didn't meet his. He was busy adjusting a small device on the table, though his hands didn't seem steady. "You're tethering yourself to them so hard you don't even notice how much it's pulling from you. That bond isn't just warm fuzzies. It's draining. It's reshaping you. You think you can handle that forever." Morty looked down at his hands. They were trembling, though he hadn't realized it until now. His body did feel weaker, stretched thin in ways he couldn't describe. But when his gaze fell back to the cradle, the glow steady and fragile, there was no question in his heart. If it means they live, then yeah, I'll handle it. Rick let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "God, Morty, you sound more like me than you realize. Always thinking one impossible cause is worth bleeding yourself dry for. You keep that up and it won't end pretty." Morty clenched his jaw. "Then teach me how to make it end better." For once, Rick had no retort. He just stared at him, something unreadable in his eyes, before looking away. The silence stretched, heavier this time. The next few days blurred together, filled with small, fragile rituals. Morty whispered to the child each morning, watched the glow rise and fall, and let the bond guide his heart into rhythms that felt almost like family. Rick came and went, returning with scraps of tech, strange metals, and broken pieces of things Morty didn't ask about. The house grew cluttered, but it also grew safer, or at least Rick was trying to make it that way. Still, Morty felt the edge of something gathering beyond the quiet. The bond told him more clearly each night that danger was circling, closer now than before. The shadows weren't gone. They were waiting, watching, learning. And then on the 7th night since the breach, it happened again. Morty woke to the hymn in his chest spiking, sharp and urgent. The cradle flared bright, almost blinding, and the bond surged through him like fire. He stumbled to his feet, his breath ragged, as the walls groaned and the floor shook. Outside, the night itself seemed to pulse, stars flickering wrong, as if something vast was brushing against the edges of reality. Rick was already moving, pulling levers, shouting over the roar of machines. "They found us. Brace yourself, Morty." The fracture didn't tear cleanly this time. It shimmered, warped, twisted, as if struggling against some unseen resistance. Shadows poured through, thicker, faster, sharper. Morty's chest clenched, his knees nearly buckling, but he forced himself closer to the cradle. The glow burned against his skin, and in his mind he heard it more clearly than ever before. Not words, never words, but a plea, desperate and childlike. "Stay. Don't let go." Morty gritted his teeth, pressing both hands to the cradle. His body screamed. His veins felt lit with fire, but he held on. "I'm here. I'm not letting go." The shadows writhed, claws striking against invisible walls that rippled with each impact. Rick's machine sparked and whined, trying to contain the surge. But it was Morty who felt the brunt of it. His soul stretched thin across the tether, his heartbeat syncing with the glow's frantic rhythm. He felt every ounce of fear the child carried, every ounce of trust they placed in him, and through that bond he pushed back, not with strength he didn't have, but with something rawer, the stubborn, unbreakable refusal to abandon them. The room shook as though reality itself was holding its breath. For a long, terrible moment, Morty thought he might tear apart, that the bond would snap and leave them both hollow. But then through the crushing weight, something shifted. The glow flared, brighter than ever, and Morty felt not just their trust, but their strength, shared, offered freely. Together, they pushed. The shadows shrieked, unraveling into smoke, clawed hands scattering into nothing. The fracture wavered, then collapsed inward with a deafening crack. Silence crashed down. Morty collapsed to his knees, gasping. His vision blurred. The cradle dimmed again, its glow steady but faint, as though exhausted too. He leaned his forehead against it, tears streaming freely. We did it. Rick's footsteps approached slowly. He crouched nearby, not touching, but close enough to feel present. His voice, rough but strangely gentle, cut through Morty's ragged breaths. "You're not the same kid you were, Morty. And after this, you never will be." Morty closed his eyes, his hand pressed tight to the cradle. He knew Rick was right. The bond had changed him forever. But as the glow pulsed faintly beneath his palm, he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even his old self. The air in the house felt different after the fracture sealed. It wasn't peace exactly, it was the stillness of a battlefield after the noise. When smoke still lingered and hearts hadn't slowed, Morty lay on the floor longer than he meant to, his chest heaving, his palms still pressed against the cradle as if afraid letting go might undo everything. The glow inside it pulsed faintly, steadier now, but quieter too, like a heartbeat catching its breath. Rick leaned against the wall, silent for once. His lab coat was scorched, hair more wild than usual, hands trembling faintly as he fiddled with a half-broken flask he didn't even bother drinking from. His eyes flicked toward Morty, then away, as though he couldn't decide whether to offer help or distance. Morty noticed, but said nothing. Some silences weren't meant to be filled with words. When he finally managed to push himself up, Morty's legs wobbled, weak from the bond's toll. Yet beneath the exhaustion was something stronger than before. The connection hummed inside him, not painful, not draining, but alive, as though the child's strength had mingled with his. Their survival no longer just his burden, but a shared defiance against the dark. He turned toward Rick, voice hoarse but firm. "They're not just surviving because of me, Rick. We're surviving because of each other." Rick's brow furrowed, his mouth twitching with the start of a smirk that never fully formed. That's the kind of line people say before they burn out. But maybe you're onto something, Morty. Maybe. The days that followed blurred again, but differently now. Morty moved slower, his body adapting to the weight of the bond. He noticed things he hadn't before, the way the glow shifted with his own moods, the way warmth spread through his chest when he whispered gentle words, how fear could rattle the cradle even when he tried to hide it. The connection wasn't one way. He wasn't protecting them alone. They were tethered, each anchoring the other. Rick, for all his warnings, began building more defenses around the house. Layers of shielding Morty didn't understand, machines humming low in the walls, generators that flickered faint blue during the night. He didn't say much about it, but Morty knew. Rick didn't build fortresses unless he thought there was something worth keeping inside. And still Morty couldn't shake the sense that the fractures weren't random. Each attack had been closer, fiercer, as though the shadows weren't just hunting. They were testing, searching for weakness, preparing. The bond hummed louder each night, not with panic, but with warning. Something bigger loomed ahead. The 15th night came quietly, too quietly. The stars outside glowed sharp, their light cold against the glass, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Morty sat awake by the cradle, exhaustion pulling at him but unable to make him rest. His fingers brushed the edge of the wood, tracing invisible patterns, whispering nonsense words just to keep the bond steady. The glow responded, faint but alive, its pulse syncing with his voice. Then Rick's voice cut through the quiet, low and unsteady. Morty turned. Rick stood in the doorway, not with his usual bravado, not even with a tool in hand, just standing there, shadows curling around him, his expression unreadable. "You know it's not gonna stop, right? Whatever that thing is that's tied to you now, the universe isn't just gonna let it go. They'll keep coming. And every time you push them back, the push gets harder. That's the rhythm of it." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "But the choice you've got now, it isn't about running or fighting anymore. It's about deciding how far you're willing to let this change you." Morty swallowed hard, throat tight. He looked down at the cradle, then back at Rick. His voice was quiet, but steady. "I already made that choice, Rick. The second I touched them, there's no going back now." For a long moment, Rick just stared, his eyes reflecting both something like pride and something like dread. Finally, he sighed, shoulders slumping. "Yeah, guess you did." And then it happened again, but different this time. The glow in the cradle surged suddenly, brighter than ever before, flooding the room with light that cast no shadows. Morty staggered back, shielding his eyes, but the bond yanked him forward again, pulling at every fiber of his being. He gasped, clutching his chest as the hum in his veins roared into a song, powerful, overwhelming, alive. Visions tore through him, endless skies breaking, oceans boiling, hands clawing from the void. But woven through it all was something else. A voice, not words, but intent. Not pleading anymore, not fearful. Something stronger, a call. Morty's knees buckled. He saw himself not as he was, but as something larger, his outline blurred with light, tethered not just to the cradle, but to everything around him. He felt the child's heartbeat inside his own, not separate but fused. And for the first time, he understood. This wasn't just survival, this was transformation. The bond was no longer an anchor, it was becoming a core, rewriting him from the inside. And in that terrifying, blinding moment, Morty knew there would be no line between them anymore. The child wasn't just with him. They were becoming part of him. Rick shouted something Morty barely heard. The machines in the house rattled, alarms blaring, the air warped, walls bending inward, as though reality itself couldn't contain what was happening. Morty's skin glowed faintly, cracks of light tracing his veins, his breath coming out in white fire. He reached toward the cradle, his hands trembling, tears spilling freely. "I'm here. I'm not afraid. We'll do this together." The glow answered, wrapping him in warmth that felt like both an embrace and a vow. And then everything collapsed inward. Light, sound, space itself. For a single heartbeat, Morty wasn't in the house at all. He was everywhere, floating between stars, standing on shattered planets, watching shadows recoil from the light inside him. It was overwhelming, infinite, and then it was gone. He gasped back into the room, collapsing to his knees. The cradle was dim again, its glow faint, but the bond inside him still blazed like a second heart. Rick rushed forward, grabbing him by the shoulder, shaking him hard. Morty, talk to me. What the hell just happened?" Morty's lips trembled, but a small, weary smile broke through. His voice came out cracked, but certain. "It's not just me anymore, Rick. We're one now." Rick's face went pale. His grip tightened, but he didn't speak. He didn't have to. 'Cause Morty knew the truth now. The child wasn't simply under his care. They weren't just surviving through him. They had chosen to become part of him, binding their fate together forever. In the shadows, they hadn't been chasing a fragile glow in a cradle. They had been chasing him. And from now on, Morty would never walk alone.